please come on stage. We'll start and then introduce. We'll all be here. And if we could also have the first image, because the first image is the introduction to today. When I was getting ready to come on the plane to Munich yesterday, I got a call from my friends, my colleagues in Rome, who said to me, there's been another tragedy off Italy, off the island of Lampedusa. We presume that hundreds of people have died. Details started to come in, and what had happened was another boat packed, setting off from Libya, with Eritreans, with Syrians, and other nationalities, many people trying to reach safety in Europe, packed into the boat. The engine died, they went adrift, and commercial vessels were approaching, and many got very excited and came up from the hull. The boat capsized, and there are over 200 dead. Over 200 dead just last weekend. This year alone, 800 people have died trying to reach Europe. 80,000 have been rescued, but it's becoming extremely dramatic. We are living in a world today where there are 50 million people who are forcibly displaced. 50 million people who have fled their homes, fleeing war, conflict, persecution. This is more than any time since World War II, which I'm sure means quite a lot to you as a German audience. It's a reflection of a very troubled and a very violent world. And those figures that you see there put into perspective how much it's escalated even in the past 3 years. So which means if you just think of today, probably about 30,000 people are fleeing their homes. It's really hard, I think, for us to imagine when we see it in statistics like these. So today, I hope with our panel that we'll be able to bring this home a bit more personally. The Syria situation, this picture was taken one day in Iraq on the border with Syria when they decided to open the borders, and thousands of people just took the chance and ran in. The situation in Syria is extremely dramatic. There are 10 million people on the run. Most of them are inside the country, running from one city, one town to another, escaping awful bombs, escaping shelling. 3 million have taken the really difficult decision to cross the border into other countries and become foreigners. If you would read the newspapers here, and I'm sure you do, in Europe, some countries more dramatic than others, you would think that there is a huge flood of Syrian refugees trying to reach safety in Europe. The fact is that only 120,000 Syrians have sought asylum or have been resettled to Europe. It's a very small number. To put this into perspective, and I'm sorry to throw so many numbers at you, but we'll get a little more personal in a minute. The country of Lebanon has 4 million people. It has taken in 1 million Syrian refugees. If the same proportionally, if this were Germany, that would mean that Germany would have taken in 20 million refugees in the last 3 years from one country. It's very difficult to imagine, and yet Lebanon is getting very, very little support, and my organization is very, very underfunded, unfortunately. This is where they live, the Syrians in neighboring countries. Many of them live in refugee camps. They've gone from living, and I'm sure Jala will tell you a little bit about that. This was a country that was a relatively well-off country. People lived in nice homes, they had gardens, they lived in towns and villages, they were safe. So the shock for them, going from living in a house with many rooms and kitchens and plumbing and everything you can imagine, to living in a tent in a desert, is really, really tough for many of these people. Many of them are resorting to living in parks even, until we can get to them and try to find them some kind of shelter. or they're living in this town in Lebanon, an abandoned. Actually, this was going to be a private university, and the man who owned it decided that he wanted to do something good for refugees, and he gave the building to refugee families. It's practically an entire village that fled is now living in this under construction university. This is what they draw. This is a picture I took in Turkey in a refugee camp, an art exhibit of teenager drawings. And I can tell you there was not one drawing in there that had anything, let's say, pleasant or heartening to see. It was all about death, destruction, war, people being shot and killed, many images of weapons, lots of blood, but also images of the sanctuary they'd found in Turkey. And this picture I just took last week. I was in Iraq, and I was near the border to Syria in a refugee camp, and I broke away from our delegation when I saw this girl. She was just standing there all alone. And I thought, looking at the expression on her face, she represents the lost generation of Syrian children who are bearing the weight, the entire weight of this awful war on their very small shoulders. I'm very pleased to introduce Jala here, who herself is a refugee, somebody who you can meet in person instead of looking at all those statistics. Jala had the good fortune, actually, to have had a cousin here in Germany. And Germany has probably one of the most generous programs in Europe for Syrian refugees. You have 3 ways to reach safety and asylum in Germany. One is that you managed to get here somehow. If you took that boat and you managed to not to die, and you got through Italy and you came through the border, and then you asked for asylum. The second way is what's called humanitarian admission, in which UNHCR selects very vulnerable people, and Germany then takes them from Lebanon or from Jordan. Or, like Jala, you have a family member here, and the different Länder have programs where they provide family reunification. But Jala actually did not want to leave Syria. She's from Damascus. She was helping for many years, actually, Iraqi refugees in Syria. This is how absurd the world is. Syria was the sanctuary for 1 million Iraqi refugees. And she was helping them get over their own trauma when the war came. And she started then helping her own people with a particular focus on women. But then it became too dangerous and too difficult for her to stay there. She's now in Berlin, in Potsdam, and she's working for the government there, helping, also giving back, working for refugees and migrants, and trying to make the best of a new life. I'm very pleased to introduce you, Jala.
Well, hello and good morning. I know it's a heavy subject to start the day with. Actually, I would like to go back to Melissa and say, really, Germany has the most generous program for Syrian refugees now. And it gives more chance and hope for people who had lost all the hope in life. I cannot be not emotional or very objective because it touched me directly. And actually, those photos, I witnessed them personally. But we need also to be calm a bit because it's a long way. And the war is not going to end now, unfortunately, and the effect of the war will continue for a certain time. And I would like to not talk about buildings or camps or bombing. I will talk about something else, which is trauma, which is the story of unsaid sufferance of people suffering from trauma in Syria, especially old people, children, and women. Trauma now in this type of world, it's a new generation of war where it is sustainable, unfortunately. It's not like one hit-and-run war. It continues, and the effect takes a long time. So it's like a big earthquake at the beginning, and then you have, after the big trauma, the first trauma, you have main other shocks coming and aftershocks, like an earthquake. And this is why the healing process is long, and building the resilience of people will come a big challenge with the time. Syrian had a very good coping mechanism at the beginning, but with the time it's breaking down because they face minimized help and a lot of suffering. And I would just take witnesses from women who suffers from one of the horrible things of this war, which is systematic rape or war rape. It's not a small incidence of rape, it's a group of people, armed people, that goes in certain areas and rape women there in order to break their resistance and to punish them. It's a type of punishment in war. And I would like just to tell you a small story about, I've heard a lot of stories, of course, but one who witnessed about how is coping, living with the incident is very difficult afterward. In a small village, people refused the access of a terrorist group inside their village. They were afraid to be punished also by the government, and they were afraid of those armed groups. We should remember also that armed groups in Syria are not composed only from Syrians. There is also people who are not Syrians in those groups. And the leader of this opposition against those people, armed people to come inside, and his family and the people around were punished. And they chose this type of punishment, which is rape. They took the daughter of this leader of the village in the main center of the village, and 20 men in front of everyone raped her, cut pieces of her body, abused her, and humiliated her. She was thrown in the woods, and no one was capable to help her because they were so afraid to be punished also. And she wasn't the only one. There was 7 or 8 people women of the same village who were punished in the same way. I won't tell you the story how she managed to get to a safe place because it was totally voluntary, risky issue for people who helped her around the village and in another city, and all those people are Syrian and under danger like her also. And she reached Damascus with all the trauma, with no health support, with no psychological support, with no protection. Now, she's getting better. She went out Syria, she got treatment, but she keep asking 2 questions. Why this happens to her, and what happened to the other women, her friends, her village members, that had to face the same trauma. And also, she suffers from the flashback of looking to members of her family and other people and remember the bad situation and the bad images of this stage. Her father died the next day of her rape with a heart attack because he failed to protect her, because he felt ashamed, because he felt also that maybe if he just let them pass away, the women in the village will not be hurt. The story is not one story, there's a lot of stories like this. And it doesn't stop inside Damascus or inside Syria. It goes across the border. When they go across the border, they are subjected to exploitation. Kids work to be able to support their family. When they try to cross to Europe, they are subject to to human traffic. Members are sold, people are sold, and this war is dehumanizing the human being and breaking what is inside a human being. I mean, when the war stops, like UNHCR and others will help gather money, getting food, getting medication, and rebuild buildings and infrastructure. But what I'm afraid of, if this war takes a longer time, that we will not have the same beautiful society living together, different ethnies, different religions, different types, again in the same country able to rebuild it again.
Thank you, Jala. I have to move to the next, but what you're saying is we have not only people who've had to flee bombs, who've had to flee violence, but what we have is a whole society that is broken in many ways. And I think the work that you do and the work that my organization also tries to do is to ease the trauma so that people can pick up the pieces of their lives and heal, not only because it's the right and humane thing to do, but also because we care about the future of Syria and we care about stability and peace. And if you have all of these people who have been violated in the worst possible ways, children who have seen things that no child should ever see, and you do not invest in the healing of their trauma, then what you're doing is you're developing an angry, frustrated generation who might perpetuate the war. So I think the work here that's very important. It's my pleasure to introduce Charmaine, who has dedicated her life actually to helping traumatized people, many refugees around the world. She's worked in many parts of Africa. She's worked in the Middle East. And now she's here in Germany. She's living in Munich. And she's doing her best from here to give back. Today, and she was still working in many parts of the world, but she has a specific project actually in Bulgaria. And in Bulgaria, it's one of the only is the only land borders to Europe. And Syrians are trying to reach Europe via Bulgaria. Many have. Now the border is actually closed, so they're stuck when they reach there. But when they did reach Bulgaria, they were met with a terrible shock. And Charmaine is going to tell you a bit about that.
Good morning. So when they reached Bulgaria, they thought that they had come to a place where they could be safe. They thought that they could come to a place where they could get help and assistance. And instead, they reached a place that was ill-prepared to look after them. They came in their thousands, whereas Bulgaria had had about 3,600 refugees a year. They had that amount in a month. And the conditions that they were placed in were derelict buildings. When I went there was sewage and water flowing in the buildings. There was no heating. It was a very, very bad condition that they were placed in. And we saw a lot of people that were very depressed and sleeping. There was no way that you can recover. And when you look at the situation and where they'd come from, people who were like you and me, proud, upstanding people who came from Syria and now were living in these conditions after what they'd been through, not only in Syria, but trying to make their way through to Bulgaria, often under very dangerous conditions. And 1/3 of the refugees are children under the age of 12. So we decided what we would do is we would try and see if we can help them in a practical way by giving them transitional housing. We worked in conjunction with partners in Bulgaria, the Bulgarian government and the Red Cross, and we did very basic things like looking at fridges and linens and this kind of thing to help them have dignity and to start restoring their life. But more importantly, we decided that we had to help the professionals who really needed capacity building on how to assist these refugees that had been through this terrible trauma and to meet them where they were at. And what we did was a psychosocial project where we took German and Israeli expressive therapists to Bulgaria to work with the Syrian refugees, in itself a message that there can be reconciliation, there can be peace, there can be hope. And we started working with them, and I'm going to quickly take you through a sequence of photographs. Here you see someone describing a traumatic incident, and you can see that the pen is hard and it's black as the trauma is expressed, and they close their eyes and they do it with two hands so that the trauma can be expressed through how they are drawing. And if you do the next.
I don't know why it keeps happening.
It's okay. The second picture, you see there's more of a flow as they think about the trauma and as it gets expressed, and it starts to flow out of them. And the next one. You can see that it's like a kite, it's like something flying, and you can see that it's changed. It isn't the harsh, hard expression of the trauma that they've been through. And if you look at the final photograph, you can see that there's symmetry between the left and the right side, and it almost looks like two angels. And this is the type of thing that we do, whether it be in art therapy, music therapy, many kinds of therapy to help them work through the trauma. And one last example of a small child that kept coming to one of our social workers and saying, my house, drawing a picture of a house, and the social worker said, how do we deal with it? And what we did was we got the social worker and the child to draw the picture of a home together. So the social worker would draw one part and then the child would draw the other part. And it's these kinds of methods that we use with the Syrians and with the Bulgarian authorities that are trying to assist them to try and deal with some of the trauma and to help them through this transition period that they are in as they then try to look for what's next. What is the next stage in their lives?
Thank you. I think maybe to conclude, if I can ask each of you maybe to tell from just spontaneously what you think are the three things that a refugee needs once they finally make it to safety. They've escaped the bombs, but now they're in another country, a foreign country. What is it exactly that they need?
Dignity. They need to be looked at like you and I would want to be looked at. The second thing, I think, is choices. The thing that is so beautiful about our lives living in a first world country is that we have choices, and we need to give them the same choices that we have. And the final thing, I think, is that we need to meet them where they're at and not to fear them. They are just like you and I.
Thank you. Jala, do you want to add anything concluding to that?
I think they need also hope that peace will come, and this is important, and to learn from them, because they provide us with new ideas how to do it. And it's sharing this, learning from each other, that builds a better world for both sides.
I think to learn from you then, Jala, because you survived, you were in this awful war for 3 years. You lived in Damascus. Can you just describe quickly what the atmosphere was like? What was it, the day-to-day living for you and for your friends?
For me, family? For my friends, for my family, and also for the people that we were helping, it was, first of all, shocking to survive this. No one imagined that will take a long time and will turn to such a big circle of violence. And you are always in running. You are in this waiting room, and you have your luggage beside you, and you try to live your life, but you are looking at this luggage, and you are in this waiting room, and you don't know if you will stay or you go, if you live or you die.
Thank you. And I think just to conclude, all of the refugees we speak to from Syria, they say one thing, that they just want to go home. Yeah. So this, if you're ever reading the newspaper and it's saying they all want to come to Europe, don't believe it. They actually just want a chance to be somewhere safe and to heal, until which time they can return home and rebuild their country. Yeah. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you to Charmaine and Jala.
Thank you.
Thank you.